If the second episode zoomed in to focus on the aftermath of the unspeakably violent ending of Prince Jaehaerys Targaryen as it affected the inner circles of the Blacks and the Greens on a personal level, the third episode pulls away to show how that spreads through the rest of the realm. As Aryk and Arryk Cargill are being buried together, Rhaenys drops this terrific line saying there's no war so hateful to the gods as a war between kin. It's one of those sayings that has been widely adopted in this universe George R.R. Martin created. It's repeated as something that's just natural and obvious to everyone who lives there, and it makes you wonder how it came to be. Since by design the gods are unknowable, this had to come from somewhere. Of course, it's never directly addressed, but I like to think that part of the reason is to keep brothers from prominent houses from killing each other. If you're born first and a male, you inherit a legacy. If you're born second, you inherit second son energy. And that leads to all sorts of problems in Gurm's universe. Daemon's got it, Otto's got it, and Aemon's got it. Two of them also have dragons, which is the second part of what she says. And no war is bloody as a war between dragons, which the origins of that one are pretty unmysterious. Second son or not, Rhaenys is sure Otto Hightower would never have approved the mission to send Arryk to Dragonstone alone. Hotter blood has prevailed, which means the younger generation is calling the shots, which is cause for concern and a reference to the season 1 premiere, when she told Corlys of course the Tourney Knights are slaughtering each other because it had been too long since there was real war, and their lord sent them to the tourney field with fists full of steel and balls full of seed. The part I really like about this conversation, though, is when she talks about how the Youngs are out to punish and avenge, and how soon no one will even remember what began the war in the first place. She goes back and forth with Rhaenyra, who thinks the war had a clear beginning when Aegon usurped her throne. Rhaenys says, yeah, but was it then, or was it when the child was beheaded, or when Aemon killed Luke, or when Luke took Aemon's eye? That seems especially fitting in a story that's based on a book like Fire and Blood, considering how the stories of this conflict have been passed down. Sir Simon Strong will say something similar to Daemon at Harrenhal later. Simon is my second favorite of the new characters. Don't let his laid-back attitude or advanced age fool you, because this guy is a knight, and way cooler than the other one we're introduced to, Alicent's brother, Sir Gawain Hightower. When Daemon asks why the houses Blackwood and Bracken have long detested each other, Simon says the answer to that is lost in time. Sin begat sin, begat sin, begat sin. This will bring me back to the episode's opening scene, where we see the beginning of the hostilities that will be remembered as the Dance of the Dragons play out. We see some Brackens and some Blackwoods do what their families have been doing for generations, arguing with each other. The Brackens have declared for Aegon, while the Blackwoods have chosen Rhaenyra, and that's as good a reason as any for them to get to slaughtering each other. You might remember our first introduction to these two families in Season 1, when a young Rhaenyra visited Storm's End on her tour to find a potential husband. Willem Blackwood, who very much looks like a child, presents himself as a suitor, and then guts Gerald Bracken in fairly dramatic fashion after he disrespects him. As Sir Simon indicates, there's a long history of this type of behavior that goes back to the time of the First Men, which is mentioned throughout the books. It would be a lot to get into here, but you get the gist. Beyond the history involved, there's quite a lot that I like about how the show incorporates the battle we see the aftermath of in this opening sequence. It shows the argument that serves as the inciting incident, two young men out to prove themselves, and then opts not to show the fighting, instead cutting to a view of the battlefield after the fact. We see the body of the young Bracken, who was visibly skittish after drawing his sword, and then an overhead shot of just so many dead bodies on the battlefield. You see how quickly things can escalate, and how many lives are lost in the process. In King's Landing, where Aegon has assigned his best bros to be his Kingsguard, and Criston Cole is battling imposter syndrome, the king is pumped to hear that people are spilling blood in his name, finally. His master of coin, Sir Tywin Lannister, points out that both sides suffered major casualties, so they probably shouldn't view this as a victory. And his master of laws, Jasper Wilde, clarifies that this is just an excuse for the Blackwoods and Brackens to indulge their ancient feud. Aegon couldn't care less about the details because the war he wanted is now on the horizon. This is that hotter blood prevailing that Rhaenys brought up, and touches on the way things are remembered. To the nobles, this is just a thing that happened, and the human cost is barely a consideration to the king. Just as Jaehaerys' death was a thing Rhaenyra did, that she now has to pay for. You can't miss the differences in his reaction to the prospect of war, and that of Rhaenys and Rhaenyra, with the former urging the queen to reach out to Alicent in hopes of avoiding a full-blown conflict. One area where both sides agree is that the Riverlands are the key to the war, and Harrenhal is the key to the Riverlands. Criston announces he'll be traveling there with a small host of people that he's trained himself, recruiting houses for their cause on the way to grow their numbers, which he'll eventually be able to leverage to take Harrenhal. Aegon likes the idea, and when he hears that Aemon and Vhagar are needed to defend King's Landing, he announces he'll be tagging along with his dragon, Sunfire. Everyone present delivers an expression that indicates that this is a bad idea in their own way, and they convince him that the risk is too high and that he's too valuable for something like this. On the other side, in the last episode, we saw Daemon leave Dragonstone and presumed that he'd also be heading to Harrenhal. We see him arrive at the largest castle in the Seven Kingdoms in the reign, which makes it even spookier than you might imagine. Even knowing about the dragon fire Aegon the Conqueror rained down on it during the conquest, and the large fire Larys recently orchestrated there to murder his father and brother. Arriving on Caraxes not only looks really cool, but also means he meets zero resistance. Once he makes his way through the dank halls and discovers Ser Simon, the castle is surrendered without a second thought. There's a ton of lore surrounding this castle, which includes a curse. We pick up some of it directly through Ser Simon, and some indirectly, or perhaps just visually, later in the episode when we're introduced to my favorite new character, Alice Rivers. The sequence opens with an establishing shot that originates on a weirwood tree, and then gives us a better look at Harrenhal's exterior before we see inside. And I mean, there is just so much going on here that I'm not even sure what I should explain and what the show will inevitably explain on screen in the coming episodes. This isn't a new location. In Game of Thrones, Arya spends a good portion of Season 2 at Harrenhal while Tywin Lannister's there. The first season of House of the Dragon opened with a flashback to when King Jaehaerys held his Council of 101 there, and later in that season, we saw Lionel escort Harwin Strong back to Harrenhal after he attacked Criston in the training yard, where as mentioned, we saw them meet their end. In my last video, I laid out the strategic reasons why it's important, and the Council and later Daemon mentioned all the same reasons and conversations in this episode. It sits in an important central location. It's big enough to garrison a large number of troops. The Riverlands have access to resources needed to support an army, and so on. But to get back to the sequence that starts on the weirwood tree, you might remember that the faces on the trees are connected to the children of the forest, and that the trees themselves are sacred to followers of the old gods. When the Andals invaded Westeros, they cut down most of the wild weirwood trees. But towards the end of that conflict, after they already conquered the south, according to the history in the world of Ice and Fire, they left some behind in the castles like this one, in an effort to prevent further bloodshed that was rooted in the different religious beliefs. So seeing roots in the walls inside the castle and this vision or dream that Daemon has is pretty exciting. Generally speaking, since it's focused on the Targaryens, Fire and Blood doesn't include much of the magical elements from the story. I mean, besides the dragons and Targaryen dreams. A lot of the stuff related to the children of the forest and the old gods isn't as prevalent as it is in the mainline A Song in Ice and Fire books. The show's version of the telling has reason to want to connect itself with Game of Thrones, though, since pretty much everyone alive has seen it. And it's already introduced Aegon's prophecy of A Song of Ice and Fire, which is directly related to the coming of the White Walkers. So who knows, maybe the show will lean into some of these things that are there, but sort of exist in the margins of Fire and Blood. Either way, we find Daemon in his room looking annoyed by the dampness and general disrepair of his lodgings. He has a couple of swords wedged in the door handles to keep anyone from coming in. I guess he doesn't take Ser Simon at his word that he's welcome there. And through the space under the door, we see somebody's feet approach, and the person try to push them open. Daemon grabs Dark's sister before opening it to find there's no one there. He He sees a lit fireplace in a nearby room, and when he goes inside, he finds a younger Rhaenyra. They brought Millie Alcock back to reprise her role. Always coming and going, aren't you? And I have to clean up afterwards. As he comes around, he sees that she's holding the body of Jaehaerys and stitching his head back on his body. As she goes about her work, just sort of humming to herself, he starts to get emotional before dropping the Valyrian steel sword on the ground, and as it hits, he opens his eyes to see he's standing in front of the God's Wood outside the castle. He turns to see Alice Rivers watching him, and she tells him that he'll die in this place as matter-of-factly as it could be said, before walking away like she's not terribly interested. We'd seen her briefly in an earlier scene, but this is my kind of introduction. Alice is the type of mysterious character that all of the different contributors to Fire and Blood have opinions or theories about, but you never really know who to trust. There's only one thing they all agree on, and that is that she would have been at least 40 years old at the beginning of the dance, but looks much younger. You can't get a great look at her here, but the actor they hired, Gail Rankin, is 34 years old in real life. One of the backstories the book posits is that she was a bastard born to Lionel Strong and an unknown woman, which is why she has the last name Rivers. The other stories are a bit more out there, but since there's a good chance we'll see more of her in the show, maybe find out things that we didn't find out in the book, let's wait and see how they choose to portray her. Beyond the spooky Weirwood tree castle and Mystery Lady telling Daemon he'll die there, I think the whole relocation part of this is good for Daemon. He has that second son energy, so he has to be doing something to feel like he's making things happen. And as Rhaenys mentioned, he's not great at being commanded. Back at Dragonstone, his better half is thinking about what Rhaenys said and the letter Alicent sent her that she hasn't read yet. Not much time has passed since Aegon's coronation, but the Jaehaerys incident has accelerated the need to do something. Before she sits in with her council, she has a conversation with Mysaria, who she finds watching Sea Smoke, who Rhaenyra tells her has grown restless of late, but they don't know why. The White Worm would like to be compensated for turning around to alert the guards about Ser Arryk's arrival. She wants a place at Rhaenyra's court and argues that her knowledge of the Red Keep and the movements of those who serve there is extremely valuable, and adds that she understands the struggles of the small folk, and they'll be ruled by the Queen or the Usurper. Those are the only two choices. And because Rhaenyra showed her grace when she could have withheld it, Mysaria has chosen to support her. Rhaenyra then meets with Rhaena and tells her that she's decided to send her son Joffrey to ward with her cousin Lady Jane Arryn in the Vale. When Jace went to meet with her, she pledged an army in return for a dragon. So even though Caraxes is just a hatchling, it's definitely a dragon. Rhaenyra also informs Rhaena that she wants her to accompany Joffrey and her younger boys Aegon and Viserys and Aegon's hatchling Stormcloud. They'll need to continue to the free cities, and she's counting on Rhaena to be the mother to them that she won't be able to be. This is a pretty important job, and it could be seen as an honor, but Rhaena has always felt less than because she doesn't have a dragon, and because her father has never paid attention to her. Her reaction makes it plain that she doesn't want to go, but she begrudgingly accepts. Rhaenyra says goodbye to her children, not knowing when she'll see them again. Rhaena and her sister Baela say goodbye, and while she's upset at having to become, in her words, a nursemaid, there's some consolation when Rhaenyra gives her a clutch of eggs to protect in case things go terribly wrong at Dragonstone. Later, alone in her room, Rhaenyra cries over her children's toys and then decides to read the letter from Alicent. You can only see the first few lines as they show her unrolling it, but her reaction looks like it inspires curiosity rather than anger. In King's Landing, Criston gets ready to leave on his mission to the Riverlands, and Alicent introduces him to her brother before informing him that he'll be tagging along. He's got a very I'm highborn vibe, and even though this is his formal introduction, it should be remembered that he did appear at the tourney in the first season, and was getting the better of Daemon before he tripped his horse. Criston looks not thrilled about bringing him along, and Gwaine peppers all of his conversation with condescending remarks to almost make himself less likable than Cole, which is a real achievement. Alicent gives Criston her favor after he asks so he can think about their sexy time, and Sir Gawain gives them a lingering look from across the yard. Once they get out on the road, Cole is trying to push ahead while Gawain is pushing for an inn and night of comfort. It seems to be out of sync with the mission objectives of staying off the radar, but before Criston can try to talk them out of it, Baela appears overhead on her dragon Moondancer. They're out in the open and have to make a mad break for the tree line, and Baela, who was supposed to stay high and out of sight, makes a thrilling dive and almost catches them. It's a pretty badass scene. And not just because of the action, which was intense and looked quite good. More because the whole thing feels unique. Moondancer is a little larger than I was expecting from the book. In the show, it just looks a bit smaller than Sea Smoke. But if you compare this scene to Laenor going into battle in the Stepstones, or Luke flying to Storm's End, they all have distinct details specific to the dragon, and the rider as well. In general, this episode gave us a much better look at who Baela is as a character, building off of last episode's scene with Jace. There was almost a different version of this story where she would have met Aegon and Sunfire above the field instead of chasing some knights on horseback as they rode towards cover. The king had made it as far as putting on his very nice looking Valyrian steel armor and having his man standing there next to him holding Blackfire, all with the intention of meeting up with Cole's host before Larys does a Jedi mind trick on him. He presents him with competing narratives. One is that the king sends his forces to battle, and his courage and wisdom flies with him. Another is that Aegon was outwitted by his counselors and persuaded to fly support for Ser Criston so that Alicent and Aemon could rule while he was gone. Which is also kind of funny because now Larys is on the outs with Alicent. The idea of this happening is enough to get Aegon to stay in the capital, and we get a better idea of how unserious his bros he's made his Kingsguard are. In case the guy lounging on the stairs in his cloak and armor weren't enough to convince you, his reaction to being sworn to chastity should be. With flying into battle now on the back burner, they opt instead to head to a brothel. Before they get there, we get a formal introduction to another new character who appeared briefly in the last episode in the street where the rat catchers were on display. It's a formal introduction if you believe him. Ulf claims to be the grandson of King Jaehaerys the Conciliator, son of Balon the Brave, bastard brother of Daemon and late King Jaehaerys. This would also make him Rhaenyra's uncle, so it all could be a little suspicious. He refers to himself as a dragon seed, which is a name used to refer to Targaryen bastards, which, make no mistake, there are a lot of running around the Seven Kingdoms. Before he can elaborate any further, Aegon arrives with his party, and then they eventually move on to the pleasure house, where he takes the squire they planned on bedding in to the same sex worker he took Aemon to on his 13th birthday. And to his surprise, he finds his brother there again. He takes the opportunity to try to humiliate him, and Aemon gets up, plays it off like he doesn't care, and walks away nude. The way this all plays out serves as evidence that he does care, but I'm not sure Aegon is able to pick it up the same way the audience is. In another awkward interaction for the Greens, Helaena, who we don't see much of in this episode, tells Alicent she feels sad about Jaehaerys, but thinks she shouldn't. She reasons that people die all the time, especially babies because they're so small. Which I think it should be stated that dying and being brutally beheaded in front of you are not the same thing. But her mother assures her that being sad is a condition of motherhood. Helaena brings up the procession and the right to grieve, pointing out that the small folk lose their babies more than anyone. It's a bit strained like their conversations are, but Alicent gets in that while she loved Jaehaerys, her real concern is for Helaena. And then her daughter tells her she forgives her, which is painfully sweet in a way, considering that she's the only one that knows Alicent and Cole were together when the murder took place. Baela returns to report seeing Criston Cole, and this puts Rhaenyra's council on high alert. While in their last couple of encounters these guys were perhaps too gung-ho, they're not nearly as wrong here. The Greens are on the move and not doing anything isn't really an option. To her credit, she listens to what they have to say. They assume Cole will be heading for Harrenhal. She's not immediately concerned about that since Daemon has Caraxes, but they do a pretty good job of figuring out Cole's plan. They urge her to loose the dragons and burn him out. which honestly seems like a measured response given that Baela has just returned and can confirm that none of their dragons are there. It presents her with a situation that could be time sensitive, but if she were to act, it would mark a point of no return. The other part of this is she's already lost one son to Vhagar, who is still very much on the game board, and if she were to act now, she'd almost have to send Baela and her heir Jace. Rhaenys would be the other option, but she's not putting herself forward as a volunteer. Situationally and strategically, there really isn't a question of what she should do, but as a human and a mother, it's much more complicated. She's also been mulling over what Rhaenys said at the beginning of the episode about Alicent, and has already read her letter, which we don't know the contents of. So she thanks her council for their input and summons Mysaria so that she can try to put together a plan that doesn't involve Dragonfire. She says if war can be averted, it's her duty to avert it, which I don't think is terribly unreasonable. Based on their earlier conversation, Rhaenyra has found a use for her knowledge of the comings and goings of the Red Keep. Her plan is absurd on the face of it, and I like that we get confirmation of that through Mysaria's reaction and responses. You want to talk to her. Killing her would be much easier. The other thing that works well is that we're kind of in the same place as the White Worm. As they're thinking about a plan, we figure out that the Sept will be the key before she actually says it. We recently saw Alicent go there to light candles alone. We know Mysaria hid Aegon there last season, and we remember the scene of Alicent and Rhaenyra there together when they were still kids. It seems difficult, but with just a couple of names that he got from Mysaria, Daemon was able to strike at the Greens inside their home. And since then, the Kingsguard's been stacked with Aegon's drinking buddies. It feels like it could be done, which under the circumstances, with the ticking clock and urgent need to act, that might be all you have to go on. Alright, so I'm going to preface this last part by saying I cycled through a number of different feelings while I was watching Rhaenyra infiltrate King's Landing. Okay, so what are they doing? Right. Okay, they're doing it. They're really doing this. I mean, at least they completely covered her silver hair, but yeah, she's going straight into the city here. On the surface, you've got these two really great leads that had this crucial friendship when they were growing up, who definitely shouldn't ever be in the same place together unless it's in complete defeat. You would look for a reason to put them in a room together. And this is a familiar place, where they shared an important moment that further solidified their bond that's now broken. That all makes sense and is somewhat secondary anyway, since it's more about motivations, which is what they laid the groundwork for. Rhaenyra doesn't want to accept that war is the only solution, and believes that there might be a chance that if she talks to this person, who she knows at her core also wants to avoid death and suffering, that they might be able to come up with an alternative. So I got a little wound up at first and then started thinking about that and started to relax. But then as they were talking, and Alicent says it's too late, because obviously it literally is. That's where I got a little stuck and spent the next 24 hours or so thinking about what Rhaenyra actually thought might happen as a result of this. Aegon has been crowned in front of the people and put on the physical throne with all of the artifacts of the Targaryen dynasty, which we were reminded of in this episode. Alicent is his mother, but that's the extent of her power after he's been crowned, which is why he was able to just throw Otto out of the room and exile him from the capital in the last episode. And, most importantly, his son has been murdered under horrific circumstances, which is public information. On the other end, as Alicent confirms, Rhaenyra isn't going there to surrender, and there isn't an outcome she'd accept that doesn't see her crowned, as she believes it's her birthright since Viserys named her heir. No matter how much you twist yourself into a knot, there isn't a solution that would be agreeable to both sides. And there isn't one where you could leave the notoriously impulsive and explosive Aegon alive if the Greens were to concede their power. Even if you made him a deal that would pacify him, he would always be a threat in that any great house or lord that didn't agree with what you were doing could try to use him to make a claim and start another war. On that front, it was interesting to see these two women come to that conclusion, and to see that Alicent was somewhat ahead because she'd probably been desperately trying to come up with a solution since Luke was killed, which I'm guessing that was what her letter was about for what it's worth. There are a few other things that come out of this conversation that seem to be key. Both hold the other responsible to some degree for their losses, but being able to look at themselves on the other side and know they weren't involved, know on some level that the situations probably mirror each other and neither one put things in motion or were in a position to stop them, this makes it hard to continue blaming blindly. And goes back to Rhaenys' comment about no one remembering when the war started. Another thing that's key is that because of their friendship, Rhaenyra has to believe her when Alicent looks her in the eyes and maintains that she believes that Viserys changed his mind on his deathbed. That opens her up to hearing her side of the story, which then leads to the revelation that he wasn't talking about his son Aegon at all. Both of the actors do a terrific job using their facial expressions to show how the characters are processing the information. It's pretty heavy to think that by the end of this exchange, Alicent knows without a doubt that her late king husband wasn't asking her to do the things she did that changed the course of history. He was just being a frail old man zonked out on milk of the poppy who thought he was still talking to his daughter who had left his room hours ago. It's a sobering thought, but here's the key. It's one that doesn't change anything at the end of the day. That's why she doubles down on it being too late. It's the truth, and they both know it by the end of the conversation, and I imagine that there was a nagging part of Rhaenyra who knew that coming in. Still, she had to at least try. The need to try outweighed the fact that there was no visible path forward. Me being caught up on what she thought was going to happen is kind of irrelevant. And what's interesting in the end is what she'll do now that every other option has been exhausted. The series, and this episode in particular, has done a good job to show that people who want to wage war will find a way to make that happen, in a way that undermines Rhaenyra's position of trying to avoid conflict at all costs up to this point. But by the end of the episode, I'm left thinking how tragic it'll be to see her abandon that. Because I don't think it's a spoiler to say that war is coming. And to loop back to Rhaenys one more time, there's no war as bloody as a war between dragons. It's so cool seeing Baela flying around up there until you think about Aegon coming up behind her and a scene that mirrors Aemon coming after Luke. So it took me a little while to process the last part of this episode, but there was a lot of other stuff in this one that I really liked. And they did do a good job of putting us right on the edge, and I think that's a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.